Gold is to refer to the fact that Jesus is the King of Kings. Epiousia, which is super essential or super substantial bread. That means that we're not talking about a French baguette here. We're not talking about, even manna probably, or something coming from heaven, like some physical thing that you're eating. Welcome to Two Truths, where we explore controversial topics in religion, philosophy, and history from at least two different perspectives. I'm Dr. Darren Iammarino, and today we're doing part one of the Gospel of Matthew. If you didn't check out the two parts on the Gospel of Mark, feel free to do that. But even if you haven't, it's totally fine to jump straight into this one. So some quick things about the Gospel of Matthew. The most important thing for all of the stuff I'm really covering today is that it's the most Jewish of all the four Gospels. So it's mainly written for a Jewish audience. Now, how could we know that? Mainly because it's constantly referencing back to the book of Isaiah or other parts of the Old Testament, right? Of the Hebrew Bible. So that's important because the other Gospels don't really have that, the Jewish audience per se. It's more for a Gentile audience. So generally, the Gospel of Matthew is going to be pro-Jewish, but anti-Jewish leadership at that time. And Jesus is basically presented as essentially like the new Moses, right? He's either got a new law or a new interpretation of the old law, if you will. And it's a pretty radical take that he's going to have on a lot of the old issues. He's also portrayed as similar to Elijah, and that makes sense because Elijah is sort of the most famous of all of Israel's prophets, and Elijah also does a lot of the things with the whole like bringing people back from the dead, ascending into heaven while still being alive, multiplying food, healing the sick, bringing fire down from heaven, etc. Like all these sort of miraculous deeds that Jesus will also sort of parallel in many ways. So let's dive into the text. And just like with the Gospel of Mark, I'm not going to be reading through the whole verse. I'm going to bring up the verse down below, and then I'm just going to be giving you multiple interpretations of the verse, right? And we're only going to be kind of jumping around to things that are more controversial. So chapter 1, verse 23, a good place to start. Here we have a very, very important account where we're dealing with the idea of a virgin birth. Now, in Greek, that term is clear, Parthenos, like the Parthenon, right? That's the term. It means virgin, as we would understand that term in English. The trouble is that in Hebrew, you've got Alma and Betula, these two terms. Alma is like a young maiden or woman of the age to be betrothed. They're married, but hasn't had any children yet, is sort of the general idea. Betula might be more closer to the virgin concept as we might understand it. So why does all of this matter? It matters because if you're talking about a virgin birth versus someone who's just a young woman giving birth, one is quite miraculous, one is not, right? So it's a pretty important issue how you choose to translate stuff. Now, in the Septuagint, they, again, are going to use like Parthenos when talking about Isaiah. So this is going to be what this is all about. I told you in the Gospel of Matthew, there's repeated quotes from the Old Testament to try to prove sort of that Jesus fulfills these prophecies, right, from the past. Now, one that's extremely important, I mean, arguably it's the most important, Isaiah 7:14. Okay, now in Isaiah 7:14, you have this idea where essentially they're looking for like a sign, and it states, "Behold, a Alma," so translate that how you want, shall, all right, shall conceive or bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And Emmanuel means like God is with us. Now, you could see how from the Christian perspective, this is extremely important because we're talking about Jesus seeming to fit right in here. Mary having a virgin birth, right? And Jesus as God incarnate, right? God with us. It fits beautifully if you want to look at it from that Christian lens, right? Now, the trouble, since this is two truths, is that if we put it in the proper historical context from the book of Isaiah and what was going on there, this is more about like the Assyrians are going to potentially be taking over, and it's like trying to give us a sign that won't happen. And the idea in the Hebrew, if we look at it like what sort of like tense that it's in like the perfect, I guess that would be what, perfect future or something like that, tense in Hebrew. So the idea is that a young woman, virgin or not, but a young woman will give or shall conceive imminently, really is the idea. It's not, they're not concerned with something that might happen hundreds and hundreds of years in the future. So like, for example, if it was referencing Jesus, that does not seem to be what the text is concerned with, because they're talking about like someone giving birth in their time, not, again, deep into the future. So there's this other, if you want to take a scientific lens on all this too, just kind of an interesting side note. Certain animals can have parthenogenesis, as it would be called. So chicken, sharks, snakes, I think even like Komodo dragons, I believe, can even do it. A decent amount of animals can do this parthenogenesis, where you basically are making like a clone, effectively, of oneself. And the idea was it was thought to be an evolutionary dead end, but it does seem that the babies can themselves undergo parthenogenesis. So it's a unique thing within nature. Now, when you think about snakes, especially, they're really important biblically as well, because, or just in the ancient world, snakes shed their skin, so they're immortal. I mean, of course they're not, but that's sort of the viewpoint. They're immortal, right? Because they can do that. And if they can undergo parthenogenesis, that also seems to be like kind of an immortality type piece. But humans can't do it. So it doesn't really matter if these other animals can, right? Hence why the whole situation with the Virgin Mary would be a genuine, miracle, right? You don't hear about this happening all the time since then or in our modern times, right? So let's jump now. Let's go to another topic. Let's get into chapter 2 now, verses like 9 through 11, I believe. Here you have the whole famous 3 wise men, right? These magi who are coming over from the east, and you've got King Herod, and he's trying to find basically whatever, right? Jesus. And so the wise men have been following this star that's moving around and then settles. And long story short, the wise men go to the house, mind you. You always think of the wise men and they're at a manger scene. That's not going on here. The manger thing is only mentioned in the Gospel of Luke. And the 3 wise men are only in the Gospel of Matthew. They're going to a house. It says it very clearly in the Greek. So the 3 wise men show up to the house with Mary there, right? And the baby, Jesus. And they present 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh. Pretty sweet gifts, at least the gold part sounds good. But it's about the symbolic meaning of what all of that is. Gold is to refer to the fact that Jesus is the King of Kings. Okay? Frankincense is because he's the high priest of high priests, if you will. Right? So like you use frankincense, right, in the temple. Then the myrrh is probably a little more obscure, but the most interesting. Myrrh is something you might wash a deceased, body with. And the idea there is that the myrrh is a reference to the fact that he's going to be resurrected, right? So he's going to cheat death effectively, right? So it shows you up front in chapter 2 that there's this foreshadowing of the mission of what Jesus is going to achieve. Now, that is important, all what I just said symbolically, but there's a much deeper layer that a lot of people would have no familiarity with. You have to know historically, maybe be a student of ancient Roman history to know this. So in the year 66, the Emperor Nero, who is not really a great guy in terms of his relationship with Christianity, the Christians do not like him. So in the year 66, the Emperor Nero invites King Tiridates I from Armenia, who is a Zoroastrian priest as well. He's a magi. And he comes over with other magi with him, a huge entourage, massively expensive. And he travels. It takes 9 months because he doesn't want to go by sea. So because of his religion. So he goes overland all the way to like Naples and then Rome. And the Emperor Nero throws the most expensive set of parties and gladiatorial games ever in the history of Rome. It was obscenely just expensive. And they paid for his whole trip and everything else to come out there because Nero was sort of, I think, impressed by him and his sort of skills in magic, basically. But regardless, Tiridates comes. He has to sort of bow in front of Nero. He sits next to him almost at near equal height. And the relationship to the Jesus story is pretty obvious. What the gospel writer is basically stating here is Rome had to spend all their money pretty much, and get this magi, these people from the East to come out to them. And there was really only one, the king Tiridates, who sort of bows before him. Jesus, who's just a baby, not paying anything, gets 3 of them to show up and give these amazing gifts. So it's sort of like a one-upmanship of Jesus being better than Rome, since Rome is the oppressor in many ways. Now, all that stuff is lost if you're reading the Gospel of Matthew in the 21st century. You'd have no concept. But remember, the Gospel of Matthew is being written, let's say, around the year 75-ish to 80. It's in the very recent memory of people that all that happened with Tiridates coming to Rome. So, very important angle for us to look at here. Now, following up right after this is that Joseph has to take the family and they have to flee to Egypt. And they stay in Egypt, it says, until King Herod is no more. So they're there a good little while. And this is intriguing because Jesus is constantly accused of being living in Egypt later as maybe a young adult during his lost years, which are most of them, basically his whole life up to the age of 30. So maybe he was possibly in Egypt at a later date when he's an adult. And maybe that's where he learned a lot of the philosophy, magic, or whatever else that some people, some early rabbis are going to accuse him of dabbling in, basically. That's how he learned how to do his exorcisms and everything else is sort of out there in Egypt, right? So that's an interesting little tidbit. But let's jump to sort of one of the main aspects of the Gospel of Matthew, which has to do with the Beatitudes and the famous Sermon on the Mount, right? So the Sermon on the Mount has Jesus climbing up this little mountain, and he then speaks to the people, and he's going to give them this ethical instruction. And it's quite a lot of stuff that he's going to bring up. But the beginning of it with the Beatitudes is very famous. So it kind of goes through like all this list of blessed are the meek, and the poor in spirit, and et cetera, et cetera. So he kind of goes through this list, which you can see in the quote, and there's different rewards, I guess you could say, given to each group, like inheriting the earth or the kingdom of heaven. Or specifically in 5:8, only one group, the pure of heart, will see God. So I think that's an important group, because purity of heart is a big, big, big deal for Jesus and John the Baptist and their whole movement. Now, let's talk about this though, because this has been a source of great contention, this whole Beatitudes section of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, one thing I think we need to discuss here, and this goes back to the Old Testament, to Genesis, is Cain versus Abel. And the fact that the Bible from the Old Testament through Jesus, the whole Bible seems to favor shepherds, right? Shepherds over farmers. And that's kind of weird, because you're like, well, why would that be? What's wrong with farmers, right? And the answer is that farmers are essentially creating a surplus. I mean, good years at least. And with that surplus, they're able to have wealth, right? They're able to have like class distinction. They're able to trade for other things and get caught more in materialism and stuff like that. You don't need to rely on God. It creates money as an idol for you when you have excess, right? Excess product leads to excess wealth and idolatry. So maybe a modern day example of something that might be more similar and will relate to even how we'll end today's video on the Lord's Prayer has to do with a need-based system of transfer of goods, right? Rather than a debt-based system of a transfer of goods. So the Maasai people in Africa have this osotua, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, it means umbilical cord system of sharing of things. So if you fall on hard times, some of your neighbors would be expected to give you, whatever it is, cattle or some sort of help. And the idea is that you don't have to pay them back in the immediate future, but you will be expected that if they need help, right, that it's sort of a bearing each other's burdens, which is what you hear again and again and again in the New Testament, right? With Paul and Jesus to bear each other's burdens. So it's a good modern day example of something that's probably closer to what maybe Jesus is suggesting in terms of a way of life. So anyhow, that's a little bit on the Beatitudes, but to bring it into more of the ethical piece specifically, Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, right? He hates this section, because this is where he gets the whole slave morality versus master morality concept. So slave morality for Nietzsche values things like kindness, humility, sympathy, whereas a master morality values strength, pride, nobility, courage, stuff like that. So a master morality is going to basically be weighing things on like the good or bad is about the consequences of something. Whereas for the slave morality, it's about there's like good or evil intentions that are being measured. So Nietzsche doesn't agree and does not think that this is natural, what's being suggested here by Jesus, and that it has led to a reversal and overturning throughout history ever since Christianity really came on the scene of the natural way of things. So, which would be more exemplified by, say, like, I don't know, the Greeks or something, Athens and Sparta maybe, or something like that. The power of military prowess and physical strength plus intellect and courage and stuff like that. And boldness and adventure seeking and all that might be associated with the Greeks. So that's just a little bit of sort of the back and forth that'll happen with discussions of the Beatitudes. But let's go a little deeper here. Let's go into more of this ethical instruction and look at chapter 5, verse 27 through 30. And we can look at that for a second. So here you have this whole issue of Jesus bringing up like adultery. And you have heard it said, ... And he's referencing like the 10 Commandments and all of these things as he's going through kind of reinterpreting important elements of Jewish law. So Jesus is basically saying here at a certain point that it's better to cut out your eye than it is to be, lusting after people, and better to cut off your hand. So we have to ask ourselves a couple things here. One, when people say they read the Bible literally, are they really reading it literally? Because I have never met a Christian that's poked their eye out or chopped one of their hands off. And I doubt they've never had a moment of lust in their entire life. So that's sort of one thing to point out here. The other thing, though, is like, let's try and really figure out what he might mean with this whole passage. And we got to look at the Greek. So the Greek here says epithumeo, which is, it does mean to desire. So that's where you could get the lust. But it means like to long deeply for, covet. I think covet is a much better word in English. And it's a much better word taking us back to the 10 Commandments, I think, as well. So lusting is, I don't think, a good interpretation, because like if you had some like quick passing desire or moment of lust, that's not really what we're talking about, I don't think. I believe Jesus is talking about a deep, obsessive, right, longing for, to possess a person, right? So in that case, what's really happening, if we take it back to the 10 Commandments, is that you are trying to, or like this person that you want to be with, that you're coveting, has become an idol for you, right? You have placed this person between you and your proper relationship with God. So now your focus and attention is down here on this plane. It's not up, right, back towards God. And that's a lesser focus, to be focusing on that which is impermanent, that which isn't really even yours to begin with, right? So I think that's really what he's getting at there, especially since it is a reinterpretation in many ways of the 10 Commandments. But I could be wrong. I welcome your comments telling me that's wrong. So by all means, let's continue on with some of his other ethical instruction. If we jump and look at this whole stretch of like 538 through like 6:1, a lot of paradoxical sort of instruction here that still is very like enlightening. So here he's going to be talking about like the whole like eye for an eye thing, right? This thing that you've heard from old Code of Hammurabi and from the Old Testament. And then Jesus is going to be talking about turning the other cheek here instead. And then he's going to be talking about giving up, your cloak or your clothes, and to give to anyone who is in need and asks something of you, which sounds very similar to that Maasai tribe, Osatua tradition that I was mentioning. So this like need-based, right, system of giving. Now, this is unusual, though, in Jesus's time, especially this idea that you should like turn the other cheek. That is hard for any men that are following Jesus, because you are going to be labeled as a coward and a female. That's a female way to do things at that time. As a man, you need to basically stand up for yourself and for your family and, your sense of honor. Your sense of honor and shame, that's your cultural currency at that time. That's your credit score. There is no 800 credit score back then, right? It's your sense of honor in the community. And that is demonstrated in public events. That's why Jesus is always having these like public battles, right? Because that's how his acquired honor will rise. But when he says stuff like this, it's kind of like, huh? What? Like, that is so weird to suggest, to like turn the other cheek. And then as we go deeper here into like this more famous line about like loving your enemies and praying for those, right, who persecute you. No. You're supposed to hate your enemies, of course, and fight against them, not love them. But there is a brilliance in what Jesus is actually doing here. So the brilliance is this. He's totally destabilizing the situation when he would do or say something like this publicly, if there's like Pharisees or scribes coming at him, because they have a preloaded expectation of like, I'm going to say this to somebody and accuse them this way, and then they're going to try and, fight back at me physically, or they're probably going to try and say I'm wrong and, have some like oral debate. But instead, Jesus like says something completely paradoxical where they don't know what to do. You see, like, even if they think he's insane for saying it, it's like, it's not even in their wheelhouse. It's a shock statement. And what that does is two things. It's going to make the scribe, let's say, or Pharisee go silent for a little bit, presumably, because they don't want to look foolish themselves and they don't know what to say, because you can't rely on just your reactive mind. Jesus is placing you in a position of like creating an opening where you now must actually respond, not react, in the present moment. And in that clearing or space is an opening for something truly new and novel. It's also an opening for a possibility for you to connect back to God rather than to connect back to your culturally informed opinions. So I think that's like at least the effect of what happens if you do what Jesus says. Now, whether or not it's exactly what he's trying to do, I don't know, but it would have that effect, I think. So let's move on to our last topic for today's video. Very important. It's chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord's Prayer. This is really, to be completely honest, this is like the summary of the whole gospel in many ways. It's a short, the Cliff Notes version. It's Jesus telling us, here's how to pray. There have been other little instructions in the Gospel of Mark. For example, praying really early in the morning, maybe right when it's like quiet, to pray alone in isolation, maybe on a mountaintop even, something like that. But now Jesus is going to give us some like specific examples of what to say and do. And he's going to tell us first off that we shouldn't babble, quotes, like the pagans do. And this has got to be a reference to like the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri type forms of magic, where you have a lot of vowel chanting or just barbarous words. If you think about like an abracadabra type, thing, like a bunch of just like made up words, babbling, that he's probably referencing that. You don't need to do that. You can be straight and more succinct in what your request is to God, right? So what is it that he actually brings up here? A couple things that I think are worth noting. So the first really important thing is there is a Greek term that's going to come up, epousia. This term does not exist in Greek, really. It's pretty much only here in the New Testament. It means super essential, Now, the thing is, if you've read only English versions of the Lord's Prayer, you have no idea what I'm even talking about right now, which is that the line where it says, give us this day our daily bread, right? That's what I'm referencing. So in Greek, emera is daily. It has nothing to do with what the word that's actually put in the gospel there. It does not say it. It does not say daily bread at all. It's really not what's being said. It says quite clearly, epiousia, which is super essential or super substantial bread. That means that we're not talking about a French baguette here. We're not talking about, even manna probably, or something coming from heaven, like some physical thing that you're eating. It seems that Jesus is suggesting here, every day, give us spiritual sustenance so that I'm kept in constant connection with God, right? That's what I need. And that's what we need too. Now, in the rest of this prayer, it seems like he gives us a little bit of a clue of how we can maybe be more likely to have that. And that's when you get into this idea of forgiving those who either trespass against you, but really it's about forgiving debtors, right? So that's what this whole kind of respite's about. And this would make a lot more sense if you understood that this concept of the importance of release and the Jubilee concept in the Old Testament, which is about releasing land, property, slaves. It's mentioned multiple times. Leviticus 25:8, all over, many places in the Old Testament talk about this idea of release of people from debts. And in fact, that's even part of the reason why God allows foreign invaders and kingdoms to destroy Israel, Judah, all this, because they did not follow this whole thing of release of people. Now, Jesus, being a radical, is taking this whole concept of release and debts and basically saying, boom, it should be instant, right? You shouldn't have anyone placed in a position of debt to you. It should be more of this kind of equal sharing thing, maybe, that I was talking about earlier, or like these Maasai tribesmen have. It's probably, it's more than what the Maasai people were saying. Because to be fair, the Maasai people, there is a expectation culturally still that it's like a proto-insurance policy. You will still help me later if I need it years from now. Whereas Jesus doesn't seem to be saying that at all. He's just saying truly expect nothing maybe, in return, and just give freely, right? And release people immediately. Not after 7 years or 25 years or something like that. You should release them right away from any debts. So it's a very interesting, very powerful statement that Jesus makes here. So I'd love to know your thoughts on all this. A lot of stuff in the Gospel of Matthew is there up front in the first 6 chapters. So in part 2, I'm going to be handling all the rest of it. But again, just focusing on some of the more intriguing or mysterious passages. So until then, be well.